You're listening to the Wool Academy podcast. This is episode number 15. Hello and welcome. My name is Elisabeth van Delden, and once a week we talk to an industry expert from the wool industry supply chain from farm to fashion and beyond, delivering strategies and insights to be successful in wool and showcasing those beautiful stories wool has to tell. Dr. Beverley Henry is a member of the IWTO Wool Life Cycle Assessment Technical Advisory Group, as well as an adjunct associate professor with Queensland University of Technology and a consultant to agricultural industries. For over 30 years, she has conducted research on agricultural systems focusing on profitability and sustainability, especially in variable climates and markets, including wool. Welcome, Beverley. It's an honor to have you on the show today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And just before we started this interview, we said we hear a lot of crickets in the background. So everyone listening, Beverley is based in Brisbane in Australia, and it's evening her time, and the crickets are active. So we have that little background as well. But now let's just get started. I gave a little introduction about yourself, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your background and the work that you do, especially in regards to the wool industry.
Well, as you said, I'm a researcher in agricultural and environmental sciences here in Australia, and I've been doing this work for a long time, but I still really enjoy it. I think partly because of the diversity and being able to work across industry like wool in particular, and government and university sectors. It's I guess I'd like to say it's a real privilege to work in an area where you're constantly learning, but also being able to contribute even in a small way to understanding how we can produce food and fibre more efficiently and with better environmental outcomes. So for wool, I started working more intensively with wool from about 2011, and I interact with wool growers quite a bit, but also with people right across the supply chain. And now most of my work is sort of more about linking the science with improved knowledge and methods for the whole industry. Because a lot of people outside of the wool industry don't really understand where wool comes from or the systems that produce it. So, I enjoy my work.
That sounds good. And I think 2011 is also the year when you and I met, when during my time at IWTO. And it's exactly that back then when I started working in the wool industry that there were some organizations that published like certain tables that rated wool as a very unsustainable textile fiber. And also at the same time, or a little earlier, there was also these newspaper headlines where it claimed that cattle and sheep are responsible for climate change. So how did these kind of research results and headlines develop? Can you take us a little bit back in history? Where are we coming from in regards to environmental rating?
It's a very good question. It really helps probably to understand the background and the context for some of the reports and those published ratings that brought you into the industry and also brought me more intensively into the science side. The context was that there was the word sustainable first came into use around 1980. It reflected a realisation that in many ways we as humans were using natural resources at a rate that couldn't be sustained in the long term. We were over-exploiting the environment for short-term economic gain. So at the same time, scientists were looking at greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, at the amount of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels to produce energy for the growing industrial sector. And we're also clearing forests for agriculture. And climate change became a concern. And we need to look at the questions of how they affected the textiles and fashion industry within that context, because concern about the impacts on the environment and what it would mean for future generations led to goals for environmental management and a need for information to make better choices to limit the environmental damage. And the fashion industry, the wool industry, all industries have an effect on the environment through their use of resources and their release of chemicals and waste. Scientists began to try to help provide that information for sustainable choices, but the problem was that the science was very new. And so the sort of results that you saw when you came into the industry were not very accurate, and they were in many cases misleading. In part, that's because wool is a natural compound. It comes from complex biological systems, and they're not easy to model. So the mistakes that were made in those early days that flowed through to the media and are often still repeated today did cause problems in trying to overcome and provide better information. So we'll talk a bit more about what those problems were with the early assessments, I imagine. But a fundamental need, if you're going to look at the sustainability of garments, for instance, is to look at the whole supply chain, the whole life of that garment, say a jacket. And those first reports on ranking the sustainability of fibres are really not going to give a good picture of the sustainability of the product that the consumer is choosing. So it's not easy to convey why the science is wrong, but that's where those ratings came from.
So in the early stages, we didn't have all the methods and knowledge that we have today, and then often you make false assumptions. Is that how I understand it correctly?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And it applies to the greenhouse issue with livestock and the reports that farming sheep and cattle, using products from sheep and cattle, are going to ruin the planet, and that it's more damaging than all of transport. The assumptions that were behind that comparison were later proven to be wrong, but the report that was done at that time did the best it could with the knowledge that it had available. So the science was still evolving at the time.
Mm. And maybe I go a little bit deeper. And how did wool then get such a negative rating? What was causing that?
Okay, so the way these ratings tools work is that they look at a number of environmental impact categories, things like greenhouse gas emissions, the effect on climate change, the amount of land they use, the amount of water they use, the amount of chemicals they put into waterways, for instance. And what is included in the ratings often depends on where there are methods and data available. But that doesn't mean that they're the impacts that are most important for a product like wool. They can be good for identifying hotspots in some supply chains, but they're not necessarily good for comparison. And I guess to put it in another way, and I'll use three examples. Wool has qualities that mean it has lower impacts than other textiles during consumer use. It needs less frequent, lower impact washing, and it lasts longer. But it's very difficult to capture the data from the diverse consumers so that stage can be included in the ratings for wool. So it's often that's the consumer use benefits are often left out. And so that disadvantages wool. So another example is that producing wool from sheep is very different to producing a synthetic fibre in a factory. It's very diverse because sheep are produced in over 100 countries. And sheep also produce multiple products. They usually always produce meat and milk as valuable products, but they can also produce milk and leather and fertiliser as manure. And dividing the impacts that the sheep makes between those different products means that the impacts of any one product, like wool, is lessened. But unless you have a method for doing that allocation between the products that is fair, you also overestimate the impact of wool. And that happened too in the early ratings. And another impact category that resulted in some of those negative stories about wool from the early ratings was the fact that one of the categories that was included was land use. So obviously it needs more land to produce a kilogram of wool than to produce a kilogram of synthetic fibre in a factory using an oil-based input. But that wasn't taken into account, and nor was the fact that sheep often graze on land that's not suitable for other sorts of production and is often very well managed, so that the wool grower is a steward of that environment and produces beneficial impacts as well. So they're just three examples that contributed to those early ratings for wool that were poor and unfair. But it's also the fact that you can't actually compare the sustainability of the products of wool from just the first stage of production, the fibre stage. So that's a long answer, but it just shows how complex it is to assess the environmental sustainability of a product like wool.
Yeah, and you just mentioned two words like stage or life stage and assess. So that brings me to my next question. So the whole method that you're using to look at the sustainability of different industry is done with the method of life cycle assessment. Can you, in a nutshell, explain what exactly life cycle assessment is?
So life cycle assessment is a tool that is, it's the most commonly used tool now for assessing the environmental impacts of products. It's a model that looks at the whole system from cradle to grave. That means the complex interactions between a product and the environment, from the inputs of raw material right through production, use and end of life, and its disposal afterwards. For wool textiles, so LCA models the use of resources and emissions to the air or land or water that occur from sheep farming to produce greasy wool, through scouring and processing to yarn and textiles, manufacturing products such as apparel, and then their care and repair during use, recycling and disposal. So I've gone through that just to illustrate too all the stages for which you need methods to calculate and data. So life cycle assessment studies are based on international standards. It says how the data should be collected and what methods should be used. But there's a fair bit of flexibility in the way you can apply that standard, and that's an important issue to keep in mind when you look at the results from life cycle assessment.
And so I guess what the situation today is that all different industries, including all different fiber industries, are then creating life cycle assessments for their individual products. You already mentioned a few things that are in particular special about wool regarding the land use, etc. But go a little bit deeper in regards to what is important to understand about the life cycle assessment for wool.
So life cycle assessment is a model. So it's always going to be a simplification of the real world. And the real world for wool is quite complex. There are some special characteristics of wool that are different to to many other products because it is a biological product. So I've mentioned before that rather than making a single product, such as you would in a factory that was specifically designed to make it, she produced fibre and milk, and fibre and meat, perhaps milk as well. And the resources such as land and water that are used and the emissions that occur from the sheep system have to be shared between those products. So allocation is an important part of the life cycle assessment that is particularly important for wool. And it's important to take into consideration the challenges that are needed to collate the data to do that, to understand what the biological drivers are for the partitioning between meat and wool, and to model those. I also mentioned that the way land is accounted for in life cycle assessment for wool is very important and also very complex. An important part of that land management is the fact that in life cycle assessment, it's difficult to count the positive impacts. So wool growers are stewards of the land, and they look after it because they want it to be productive and they want their sheep system to be profitable. So they do things like control weeds. They might plant trees for shelter. They manage the stocking rates so that the soils are healthy, and they often have better soils, higher biodiversity. They have carbon sequestration in trees, and at the moment the life cycle assessment of wool doesn't fully account for those. They're difficult to capture. And so too are the benefits later in the supply chain, including being biodegradable at the end of life.
And is it also one point that is quite crucial is that it depends also if sheep are reared in the UK or in Mongolia, in the desert, or in the outback of Australia. So that's also another level of complexity that's added in regards to wool.
It is. It's wool production or sheep farming is highly diverse, and that leads to a great diversity in the amount of land that's used, the intensity of grazing. So in some areas of Australia, it's a very low stocking rate on semi-arid lands compared to the production in France or the UK, for instance. It also different breeds of sheep have a different emphasis on wool and meat, and that affects the allocation between the two products and the factor that you use to do that allocation. So that diversity is highly important. The climates vary, the soils vary, the temperature over winter makes a big difference if you have to house your sheep. All of those factors affect the calculations in the life cycle of wool.
Yeah. And obviously you looked at the beginning of the supply chain, but then also looked at all the other steps of the supply chain, and you and your colleagues of the IWTO Wool Life Cycle Assessment Technical Advisory Group, a very long name, have done a lot of research over the last few years and also had some great achievements. Tell us a little bit about the findings that you had and how that influences the rating of wool.
The IWTO Wool Life Cycle Assessment TAG, as we call it, Technical Advisory Group, has been very busy since 2013. Science progress can be very slow, and we have been very careful in the work that we've done to make sure that it is scientifically rigorous and defensible, because there is a lot of work done on life cycle assessment that is less rigorous, I suppose, and really is more opinion than science. So a lot of our work has been focused on making sure that we can defend what we do, and that means often publishing it as often as we can in peer-reviewed scientific technical journals. And one of the first studies we did was an in-depth analysis of allocation for up to the farm gate stage. So from the beginning up to the production of greasy wool, which is where the question of allocation came in. And as an example of that, it sort of stands to reduce the calculated impact of fine wool by about 30%. And that's a big difference. And if we can improve the accuracy by that much, from a study on from the sort of study that we did based on analysis of systems in Australia, New Zealand and UK, it's a big advantage moving forward to improve ratings for wool. So that method, plus an in-depth study of all the standards and guidelines available for wool LCA, led us to produce a set of guidelines that are now published on the IWTO wool site and available for anyone wanting to conduct a wool LCA. And this will help future studies to be more consistent and more accurate. So, and those guidelines cover the full supply chain from greasy wool production right through to disposal at the end of life. Other research has focused on filling gaps in the supply chain data and knowledge, because that's a real issue in how well rating agencies can assess wool. If they don't have good data, if they don't have an understanding of how the supply chain works, they make poor assumptions or they use out-of-date information. Some of the earlier ratings used information on chemicals, for instance. It was over 30 years old, and those compounds were no longer used in the industry and hadn't been for many, many years. So we want to be able to bring data together that will reflect the good practices and the improvements that are happening now, where the TAG is currently undertaking a review of the consumer use phase, and we've invested in work on recycling of wool textiles to understand the benefits of wool in recycling. Wool is the most recycled of textiles. It's overrepresented, if you like, in returns of clothing to charities and their use in recycling. Its fire retardant properties make it very valuable for what we call open loop recycling not into another garment but into another use, such as a mattress topping, where fire retardancy is required. So we have studies that are looking at all of those aspects of the life cycle, and the aim is then to contribute to better calculations across the supply chain, and that work is ongoing.
Yeah, and I'm especially I love all those research results on usage of wool garments, and I'm really looking forward to more results on that end as well. And of course, these results are really, really powerful, but then they can only achieve something if they are actually applied somewhere where it matters. So, but I know you're also working on that side of things. Tell us a little bit about where this research then gets integrated and applied so that we can really make a difference for wool.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, Elisabeth. Unless the research is made available to the industry and to interest groups and consumers, it's not of great value. So we sort of put a lot of effort, particularly more recently as we've got results available, into communication and engagement. And a lot of that has been done in close cooperation with IWTO and the members of IWTO to meet their needs and to improve the outside knowledge of wool as well. So we're engaging not only with the industry itself, but with influential groups, NGO, non-government groups who are looking at sustainability of products, and also even with government bodies who want to give advice to consumers on sustainable textile choices. So, just to give you a few examples, members of the TAG are engaged with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which represents something like 40% of the apparel and footwear industries. And in doing that, we're contributing to technical development of the Higg Index, which is their index for assessing the sustainability of apparel. And we're having input into both the methods and making available data that has been collected by the TAG to improve those ratings. We also participate with the Food and Agricultural Organisation of the United Nations, which has a group called the Livestock Environmental Assessment and Performance Partnership, the LEAP Partnership, and members of the TAG were involved in developing guidelines for assessing the environmental impacts of small ruminants, so sheep and goats, basically. And we're currently also involved with work on the water use by livestock, on soil carbon stocks, and on biodiversity, because it's groups like the FAO that are going to support better methods for livestock assessment and overcome some of those problems that you referred to earlier, with a sort of blanket statement that cattle and sheep are going to ruin the planet. We also provide input, technical comment on issues like the product environmental footprint. That's the pilot study that was undertaken by the European Commission. And the aim there was, again, to try to ensure that any guidelines that were produced took into account the special features of wool and the wool supply chain, because the risk otherwise that wool will be disadvantaged. We also engage with a number of ad hoc issues in response to questions or in response to concern that's raised by IWTO members about material that's put on the website that is inaccurate and doesn't represent wool fairly. And so using the information and the knowledge that's generated by the TAG, we can provide responses to some of that. Unfortunately, it doesn't always generate the change we would like. And then on the communication side, we work closely, as I said, with IWTO to produce fact sheets and communication materials and articles. And we continue to publish where we can in technical journals to make sure that the science that is done by the Technical Advisory Group can then be taken up. So the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, for instance, adopted the allocation method that was recommended by the TAG, and they were able to do that quite readily because it was published in peer-reviewed journals.
That's a wonderful news, and that brings me also to my next question. So you're pretty much laying the groundwork and all the methods, and they're peer-reviewed, but then it's also up to individual companies to use those methods and find out what their environmental footprint is of their products. So what advice would you give to companies working in the wool industry and how to use the work that you're supplying to them?
I guess the first thing I would suggest is that wool companies or any aspects of the wool industry can look at the IWTO website to get an understanding of what help there is available there, and the products, such as the guidelines, and to be able to recommend to any LCA practitioners that they engage with, that they consult that information that is on the website. I have to say that, like all modelling tools, LCA has limitations. It's very useful, but I think companies also have to be aware that they need to talk about LCA in the context of all of the work they're doing. And I know that many of the companies are sort of making great steps forward on improving their environmental footprint. So, to look at LCA in that context. So, if they're going to make their own assessment, it can be very valuable. A good wool LCA is a strong communication tool. So it allows companies to tell the story of what they're doing, to document the fact that they're improving the sustainability of their operation, and that they're sort of undertaking activities, and they can demonstrate improvement over time using life cycle assessment. So they've undertaken a life cycle assessment to benchmark where they're at now. They may identify some areas, hotspots, if you like, for improvement. And often those areas don't only lead to environmental benefits, but they lead to economic benefits or more efficient production too. So that's something that companies can keep in mind. One thing that is really important, that the wool industry has a big job to do in telling the story of its benefits for environmental sustainability. And it would be great if companies interested in sustainability could collect good data. They need that to undertake their life cycle assessment and to show their improvements. But if data were made available to the IWTO tag, it could be used in a way that respected any commercial sensitivity and was presented with other data so that it was anonymous to who provided it. But we would end up with more representative data sets. And that would benefit the whole wool industry in terms of being able to develop data sets that could be provided to organisations such as the Sustainable Power Coalition or other ratings agencies wanting to undertake life cycle assessment. We still have some big gaps there.
Okay, so there's a clear action for everyone listening and who has the opportunity to collect data. Please do so and share it with the wool industry for the good of all of us. And before we wrap up, for sure we'll make all the links that you mentioned regarding the research that's available on the IWTO website. We'll make that available in the show notes. But before we close, what's coming for you? What's the future in regards to research and LCA for wool? Give us a little bit of an outlook.
There's still plenty to do. And there are both ongoing activities that we need to undertake, and in the technical side, but in the engagement side, we can improve the way we engage with other organisations and make our data and our knowledge available, and feed that into ratings tools. It's unfortunately not easy to persuade change, and I think improving our engagement with a wider range of interested parties helps the understanding of the benefits of wool. I mean, it's a fantastic, natural, sustainable product, but that doesn't always come out in what other people see, or their understanding is limited, and being able to improve that engagement, turn the science into something that is useful for a whole range of people and for consumers themselves, so that they don't read the old reports and get the wrong idea, is really important. One of the, so as well as undertaking more research to fill the gaps, I mentioned that we currently have work underway on the use phase, and that's understanding how consumers wash their products, how long they wear them, how long they wear them between washes, and the practices they use is going to be very beneficial in documenting the benefits that wool has relative to some synthetics that need to be washed every time you wear them and last for a very short time. Slow fashion is something that is becoming more attractive for a range of reasons, and wool really fits the bill there. One of the large projects that's underway at the moment is an integrated life cycle assessment that's bringing together the best information we currently have available, and also being generated in a way that makes it possible to look at scenarios. For example, different laundry habits and what difference that makes to the calculated environmental impact. And that will help promote recommendations and better practices, we hope, by making that available in a useful format. We'll continue to publish papers. We will continue to engage, as I said, and one aspect of that is actively promoting valid comparisons. So trying to overcome what was done earlier in saying that a wool jacket is going to be less sustainable than a polyester jacket because at the fibre stage, wool generates more environmental impact. That's totally invalid in a way to compare products, because what happens is about 50% of wool's total impact occurs at the fibre stage, whereas it might be 10% for a synthetic. So to compare only at that stage and say that it relates to the full life cycle is giving consumers information that could lead to choices that don't support their ethical values. So if they want to make an ethical choice, they need good information, and that starts a lot with only making comparisons that really reflect the full environmental impact across the life cycle. And that's something that's a very important part of what we're going to try to do as well.
Well, for sure you will be busy in the next few months and years to come. So thank you so much for all the work that you do. Also, please thank all your colleagues. I think the work you do is really, really valuable and important. And I'm so glad that we could explain it here on the podcast today. That's all for now, and I hope you will have a good rest of the evening with your crickets.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Elisabeth. And I'd just like to finally say that all the work that I've talked about should be credited to the members of the TAG. It's not my work. It's the whole group.
Yeah, no, I know it's been a really great team effort, and thanks so much for everyone. So yeah, that's all for now, and thank you, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Elisabeth.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to find out more about Beverley and her work, visit the show notes at elisabethvandelden.com/015. That's where you will find all the details that we talked about in today's show. Visit elisabethvandelden.com/015. Don't want to miss out on any of the future episodes? Then subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, and also like us on Facebook at Elisabeth Van Delden. Thank you, and see you next week.